Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is the Libertarian Angle, the show, as you know, that brings you the libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world. Today, my co-host is Scott Horton. It's a great honor to have you, Scott. Scott runs the Scott Horton Show, which interviews people on a regular basis, primarily on foreign policy, the war on terrorism, civil liberties. I think you would be hard-pressed to find a greater cast of people that Scott has interviewed over the years. He has just brilliant compilation of interviews on his site at the Scott Horton Show. So I invite you to go back and look at his archives, but also to take a look at the guests that he's having on an ongoing current basis. Scott, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, I thought I'd have you on to discuss, well, probably your favorite topic, certainly one of my favorite topics, and that is foreign policy in general, but specifically the war on terrorism, ISIS, what's going on in Iraq. I mean, let's face it, Scott, everywhere you look, it seems to me, there is a gigantic mess with what the U.S. government has done, especially in the Middle East. And yet you have this phenomenon that the proponents of this kind of philosophy of foreign interventionism and empire, they never acknowledge that the messes that they produce are produced by them. They only look for new ways to put out the fires that they themselves are responsible for. How long can this go on? I mean, where they just keep doubling down and making the mess bigger than ever?
I guess until the dollar breaks. I don't know. It's not going to be until, logic and reason kick in. What's interesting to me about this, Jacob, is that you can find a lot of commentary, especially from liberals, but even from conservatives, too, that will say that, look at our policy in Yemen the last few years. It seems to have been pretty counterproductive. And look at what a disaster we had in Libya. And you look at the mess in Iraq since 2003 and the civil war and now the rise of the Islamic State and whatever, it doesn't seem to be working. And that's a great argument, and I'm with it as far as it goes. But there still seems to be this complete taboo, even though we're now years out from Ron Paul winning a tremendous victory in the, public arena, not just against Rudy Giuliani, but against the war party in general, about the cause of our terrorist problem. And that it goes back before September 11th. Our government had been picking a fight with the people in the Middle East for a long, long time. So if you let people start from the premise that, well, here we were, a sleeping giant minding our own business, when all of a sudden out of the clear blue sky, terrible radical Islam came and picked a fight with us, then after that, well, hey, you can quibble about the results of some of our interventions, but they can always kind of fall back on, yeah, but they started it and we still got to finish it. Even if we haven't been doing a good job so far, we need to figure out the best way to, et cetera. But if you just go back only a decade and say, no, it was George H.W. Bush occupied the Saudi desert in order to bomb Iraq. And then when the war was over, the war wasn't over. They kept a blockade, and they kept the bases and the no-fly zones and the bombing regime throughout the entire Clinton administration. The entire bridge to the 21st century, as Bill called it, was drenched in the blood of Iraqi civilians. And that was the lead up. Even George W. Bush in the debates in 2000 said, hey, if we keep all this foreign intervention, then we're going to have some terrible consequences coming down the line. Because, yeah, that's what happens. And then after September 11th, they wanted to pretend that that was the first day in history, and you don't have to ask about what led up to it. But it seems to me that if people would just be honest, that, look, it's George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton's fault, okay? Give me a break, radical Islam. And if we could just get our head around that, which seems pretty simple to me, occupying the Saudi desert in order to kill Iraqis from there and staying and keeping the policy going for a dozen years leading up to September 11th, then that completely undermines that we were minding our own business when they attacked us because we're good and they're Islamic, and Islam makes people hate good things and want to go to terror war against it. And in fact, one more thing about this is it's really a disappointment to me that Rand Paul, Ron Paul's own son, the guy, Ron, who did the most to advance this message in the public debate, his own son is selling it out and is saying our problem is radical Islam, and right at a time in the middle of 2015 when there is a sectarian war raging across the Middle East. It's radical Shiite Iran versus radical Sunni Saudi Arabia and all of their sock puppets in a proxy war for all the marbles. And we're supposed to conflate them all together when they're in the middle of a civil war, and our government is right now fighting on both sides of that civil war, on the Shiite side in Iraq, but on the Sunni side in Syria and in Yemen right now. And right now is when he wants to revert back to this Giuliani slogan about they hate us because their religion makes them hate innocents. It's infuriating to me. It's madness. But if we could get past that, I think, as far as the public debate goes, that, hey, the 90s existed, that H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton got us into this, I think that can really do a lot to move us to a position where the public can imagine a really different policy, that maybe we can just come home if really we are the ones who started it, you know?
Yeah, I'm glad you focused in on that idea of what motivated them to strike on 9/11, because that's a critical factor. And as you'll recall, when it happened, there were those of us that were saying we have to look at motive. And the proponents of this interventionist foreign policy, empire, and so forth, I mean, they tried to slam us down every which way they could to silence us, because they wanted everybody to march in lockstep with the national security state, with the president, that they just hate us for our freedom and values, that we haven't been doing anything to provoke this. And when I say we, of course, I'm talking about the government. Well, the way I look at it, you know, they had the national security state had its nice little cush position during the entire Cold War, when they had ever increasing budgets and their position was secure. They were living off high cotton, and all of a sudden the Cold War ended. And they were freaking out about it because people were talking about the peace dividend and so forth. And so what do? They go into the Middle East. And as you point out, with the Persian Gulf intervention against their old buddy, Saddam Hussein, the guy they had given those weapons of mass destruction to, they massacre untold numbers of Iraqis. They leave him in office, and then they impose those brutal sanctions. And I think the sanctions were really the driving force behind the attacks on 9/11. Of course, there was the unconditional support to the Israeli government, as you point out, the stationing of troops during near Islamic holy lands. But it was the sanctions that were killing Iraqi children to the tune of hundreds of thousands over a long period of time. And in fact, when there was a terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in '93, which was no different in principle from the one that took place on 9/11, Ramzi Youssef, the guy that they brought in federal court as a criminal defendant, pointed to the sanctions as part of the reason why he had done this. And then you had the terrorist attacks on the USS Cole, on the U.S. embassies in East Africa. And so building up to 9/11, we were saying at the Future of Freedom Foundation, if you don't stop this, you're going to get a major terrorist attack on American soil. And the other guy that was saying this was Chalmers Johnson in his book Blowback. And so when 9/11 hit, it was in their interest to say, oh, we're innocent, we haven't done anything, this is hatred for our freedom and values, when in fact it was a direct result of their U.S. interventionist foreign policies. And let me just add one more thing, and then I'll turn it back to you, is that while I agree with you on what Bush did and Clinton did, I really don't think it's a personnel problem. I don't think it's a problem of getting the right president in office. I think it's a system problem, that you've got this philosophy of foreign interventionism, this philosophy of foreign empire, this philosophy of a national security state apparatus. And I think that if enough Americans can question those philosophies and that apparatus, then all of a sudden you start dismantling it, and you end this anti-American tradition that's been established of foreign interventionism, empire, and militarism. And now you're talking about the founding principles of this country again.
Right. Yeah. Another person, of course, who was predicting that attack was Ron Paul himself. In 1997 and in 1998, in fact, I think his statement in 97, he was quoting the Saudi government saying, man, America, you guys are really driving our crazies crazy here with some of your heavy-handedness, and I wish you'd think more carefully. And Ron was saying, see, this is what our Saudi allies are telling us, that we are overdoing it in their country, and that we really ought to think carefully about, picking a fight, sticking our stick in this hornet's nest, and this kind of attitude way back years before, and even before the Africa embassy attacks. He was saying that. I mean, I guess he didn't go back to Congress till 97, but he started along those lines almost immediately with that. And then, yeah, of course, it wasn't just Bill Clinton and George Bush, but I guess I like to say, I try to think of it in terms where, in the discussion of Rand Paul could simply frame this as Hillary Clinton's husband is the one who got us into this mess. His unremitting punishment of the civilians of Iraq. And for people who are new at this, you ought to know, neither of us are saying that Iraqis had anything to do with it. They were being avenged by Saudis and Yemenis and Lebanese and Egyptians on 9/11. It wasn't Iraqis that did it, but it was, as Jacob said, over the policy against, as bin Laden himself said in his fatwas over and over again in the 1990s. He cited America's, blockade, an unprecedented blockade, a real siege of Iraq, a UN-level siege, a blockade. When we have a blockade against Cuba, at least they can trade with other countries, just not us. But the blockade against Iraq was just absolutely total. And there's a book by Joy Gordon called Invisible War that'll just blow your mind about the severity of the punishment that the people of Iraq went through. In fact, Anthony Gregory reviewed that book for you, Jacob, now that I think about it. At FFF.org, people can read. If you just type in Joy Gordon, Invisible War, and Anthony Gregory, you can find it. And it's great. But then, so here's the other thing is, the empire, the national security state and all that, it's all just a government program, like you said, the biggest and worst of all, but it benefits from its failures in the same way that all other government programs fail, whether it's the war on poverty or the war on disease or whatever it is. The worse the problem, the better they do, since they have a monopoly, especially on being the security force. And so, Iraq War II was supposed to be easy. We're going to waltz right in there. We're going to build 100 bases, and they're all going to kowtow to us, and they're going to do what we want, and we'll have our pal Chalabi run the place, and this and that. And instead, it didn't work out that way, but hey, that's all right. You got a bunch of warring militias of suicide bomber crazies running around. We can sell some bombs and some jet fighters in the name of that. We can get some new stars for some officers' shirts. Their fancy little costume jewelry over there at the Pentagon for their little fashion shows by having another war in Iraq, or we'll call it Iraq War, 3.5 or whatever, whichever we're on now, depending if you count the Clinton years or not. And we'll just keep bombing them. We thought that the Libya war would be easy. Yeah, we'll get rid of Gaddafi, and then what could be worse than Gaddafi? And then that all went to hell. They were fighting for the Libyan veterans of al-Qaeda in Iraq, for crying out loud, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group and Ansar al-Sharia. And they've turned Libya into a complete hellhole, which was completely predictable at the time by the people who predicted it. And, in fact, the CIA and the military tried to stop Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama from doing it, but they wouldn't hear it. And so, but that's okay, because you know what? We can just further intervene in Libya down the line. I'm sure there's money to be made in dropping some more bombs on our new enemies there. And the CIA is backing this guy Haftar, or at least somewhat. I don't know to what degree, but apparently they're backing this guy Haftar. And at least he's not a jihadist. He's a secular fascist, which is better than backing the jihadists if you got to back somebody. But, the point is that they don't need a master plan, because all they have to do is fail, and they got more work, In fact, you'd love this one, Jacob. It comes from defensenews.com. They were talking about the Army's Dagger Brigade, which I forget which infantry division that is or whatever. They call themselves the Dagger Brigade. And they're saying, now that our deployments to Iraq have stopped and Afghanistan is slowing down, we're looking for work. We're looking for ways to stay globally engaged. And so we're looking at Africa. We're going to pivot to Africa. If the Navy and the Air Force get to pivot to Asia, the Army and the Marines get to pivot to Africa. And there's a whole continent ripe for pivoting to and finding things to do. And I mean, the way they say it's like out of the mouths of babes kind of thing, where they don't realize how embarrassing this is supposed to be that they would say that. They got to go find wars to get in just so that they don't have to go get real jobs, basically, now that they're no longer needed.
Yeah, and so they can keep the racket going. They can keep the military-industrial complex expanding. They keep supplying the arms suppliers. I mean, when I see what's happening in Yemen right now, where a member of the U.S. empire, a loyal member, Saudi Arabia, starts bombing Yemen, those are U.S. supplied weapons that are being used up. And that means, hey, they're going to have to order replacements. That provides a great bonanza for the arms suppliers here in the United States that have always supplied the national security state, especially since World War II. So it's a great big racket. And I'm glad you mentioned Joyce Gordon. I mean, she's had a big impact on my thinking as well. In addition to her book, if somebody doesn't want to start out with her book, they can look at the book review, as you mentioned, on our website. But she's also got a fantastic article online called Cool War that talks about the bureaucracies, the U.S. bureaucracies that were enforcing these brutal sanctions that were killing children time after time after time. And there were actually 2 high UN officials that resigned out of a crisis of conscience because of the mass number of children that were being killed. And let's keep in mind that the important thing here is that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. I mean, this was a sheer act of aggression, but it was a regime change operation. The sanctions were designed to achieve regime change, just like the embargo against Cuba has always been designed to affect regime change, and it didn't work. And so they needed an excuse to go in there and get the regime change with an invasion. And so they used the 9/11 attacks and said, oh, there's WMDs. And it was all a made-up story to accomplish what the sanctions had not been able to accomplish. Because by that time, people around the world were getting outraged over the sanctions. And I'll never forget that debate, that presidential debate where Ron Paul was in, where he said they came over here and killed us because we, meaning the U.S. government, was over there killing them. And that was a pivotal moment. I remember all the other presidential candidates went on the attack and said, oh, that's not true. They killed us for our freedom and values, and they came over here for that reason. And Ron stuck by his guns. And I think that's really where Ron Paul's campaign took off, because people started recognizing that's the truth. That here's a truth about U.S. foreign policy, truth about the national security state, the military, the CIA. It was a truth that the mainstream Republicans, and let's face it, a lot of the Democrats still don't want to confront, that it is the U.S. national security state, which is the U.S. government, that's the most powerful part of the government, is at the root of all these crises that America is now facing. I mean, you look at every bit of this mess that they think they have to do something about. They are the cause of that. From ISIS, there was no ISIS before the Iraq invasion. The mess in Libya, there was no mess there like there is today before they intervened. Syria, now Yemen. At the root of this is this whole philosophy of interventionism, empire, and militarism in the national security state.
Yep. Hey, you're reminding me, too, of this great piece by Andrew Coburn in Harper's about I think it's Crystal City. It's the area right there in your neighborhood. There's somewhere where all the defense firms have their, like their corporate park, business park offices or whatever, where they have all these contractors, and how they had some big, I don't know, war profiteers ball or whatever it was. And everybody's just so excited about the renewed Cold War with Russia. And they can't contain their excitement. They're perfectly happy to tell somebody like Andrew Coburn, oh, this is great. We're going to make so much money, and we're going to sell a bunch of planes, and we're going to drop some bombs, and it's just going to be so much fun. And they don't even hide that, in the scheme of things, there really is no other force that's interested in American politics that's interested in having a problem with Russia, other than those who would sell big-ticket fighter planes to the American people to give to our Eastern European satellite states, the American Warsaw Pact, basically. And, of course, they're risking killing us all over their own, very narrow self-interest.
Well, let's face it, this whole racket needs official enemies. I mean, that has been the coin of the realm, officials' enemies and fear, ever since at least the end of World War II. And so, they had the Soviet Union as their official enemy. They thought that was going to last forever. Now they have the war on terrorism, and I call it the greatest terrorist-producing machine in history, because their very own policies produce the anger and hatred that leads to a constant threat of terrorism. So it's the perfect racket. And now they go back to the old Cold War enemy, Russia, and who caused that crisis? Well, if we go, they'll tell us, oh, it was all Russian aggression against Crimea and so forth. What they ignore is what NATO, the critical role that NATO played in all this. And I was reading the other day that NATO was the first peacetime alliance, permanent alliance that the United States had ever entered into in its history. And I don't know if that's true, but I was amazed that was the first time. And here it was, this commitment, joining this alliance to protect Europe from the Soviet Union. So when the Cold War ends, though, does NATO dismantle? Of course not. It needs new crises. It needs new enemies. And what happens if the Middle East, if all of a sudden Americans say, get out of the Middle East? Well, so NATO keeps moving closer and closer and closer, absorbing all the old Warsaw Pact countries till they're virtually on Russia's borders, getting ready to absorb Ukraine into NATO, which of course would have put the Crimea under the control of the U.S. government through NATO. There was never a possibility that Russia was going to allow that to happen. And so now you have this gigantic crisis, again, rooted in U.S. foreign policy. What's amazing to me, Scott, is at what point do the American people say enough's enough to this? We're challenging your whole paradigm. And we see that obviously happening in the drug war, where Americans are finally realizing what a racket that is. And so you've got this entire movement that is moving to end the war on drugs, to legalize drugs, despite what Washington says. And I can't help but believe that with the manifest disaster that the U.S. national security state has done, that people are not going to start questioning that paradigm the same way they're questioning the drug war paradigm.
Well, I think it's actually already happened to a degree, certainly not enough, but, I'm pleasantly amazed, really, that they have not invaded Iraq. I mean, I can't believe that we're almost a year out from the declaration of the caliphate, where this guy Baghdadi is, might as well be bin Laden himself up there on a balcony, declaring himself the dictator and ruler of all Sunnis and all the lands west of Baghdad and east of Damascus, for now, until he's ready. And it just seems to me, you go down the list, the only army in the region that probably could do it, maybe the Iranians, although they certainly have proven that they don't want to, and the Turks could, but the Turks love the jihadis. Al-Nusra and ISIS, they don't seem to have a problem with that at all. So the Turks aren't going to get rid of them for us. The Iraqi government that Junior created for them over there can't rout them out of Fallujah and Mosul. So who can? There's only one power left in the region that can, and that's North America, right? The Americans are the last power in the Middle East that actually had the force to march the Marines into Mosul and drive the Islamic State out, which would be an absolute disaster. And I just figured that it would be on by now, and they're just not doing it. And I think, they're basically sticking to naval power and, naval and Air Force air power and Kurdish and Shiite Arab proxies on the ground. And they're terrified. Obama's absolutely terrified to put in the number of troops that it would take to actually roust these guys temporarily only, admittedly, out of Mosul and Fallujah. And, of course, the truth is that if he did that, the Islamic State would just be a militia again. It's not that they would cease to exist. He could basically make them not a state anymore, but he couldn't completely annihilate them. But so, it seems like, if not because of public pressure, at least inside, the military, they're saying, look, as David Petraeus said in 2003, tell me how this ends. If we're going to actually invade the place, how in the hell are we ever going to get out? And it's amazing to me that they apparently seem to be content to go ahead and let the Islamic State exist as the status quo. Now, maybe that would change under Hillary or Jeb. I don't know. They're really, I think they're terrified to see a George W. Bush style re-invasion of Iraq. It's just a nightmare. And I think maybe there are parts of the Pentagon that sort of felt like, well, we stole it fair and square, so it belongs to us. But as far as I think now going back after being gone for 4 years or 3.5 years or whatever, I mean, they do have a couple of thousand guys there, special forces and spies and obviously air power. I'm not saying that they're non-interventionists now, but they're terrified of putting the 3rd Infantry Division or the Marine Corps in there. And I'm very happy about that. And it's not like they care about the Marines or the Army. It's mostly because they care, probably, I guess, they're scared of the American people and what kind of reaction they would get if they did a full-scale invasion of Iraq, which is what it would take, apparently, to get rid of the Islamic State at this point. And I think the Islamic State, they're bad enough dudes. I mean, bad enough guys, not bad enough dudes in a bad hombres way, but they're bad enough people that they, I think, are destined to be bad enough at governing that they won't be able to for very long. I mean, they're much more powerful than they were back, 10 years ago or 9 years ago. But 9 years ago, the local Iraqi Sunnis turned on al-Qaeda in Iraq and kicked their ass and threw them out. Now, they had American help at the time, but their motivation for doing so was the al-Qaeda guys named themselves the Islamic State of Iraq and started claiming to be the government of Sunnistan. And the locals just said, no, man, we're the ones who are from here, not you. And very quickly and pretty easily marginalized them. So I think ultimately that's the solution to the ISIS problem anyway. I don't know if Hillary or Jeb are crazy and evil and stupid enough to do a full-scale invasion, but I also don't. I guess at this point I have to highly doubt that the Islamic State is going anywhere in the next couple of years. For the rest of Obama's term, if he doesn't invade, they don't seem like they're under that much pressure from their neighbors, from the Iranians or from the Syrians or anything like that. So, or even from American airstrikes. So it's an interesting thing to watch, though.
Yeah, it really is. And I don't see how they could have expected anything different, that when you go in there and you affect a regime change violently, there's going to be people that you've ousted that are going to be very angry about this. And in fact, ISIS also consists of many of the old Saddam Hussein people who were ousted from power by the U.S. government. So it's not surprising that they've joined the insurgency against the U.S. installed regime. So you end up with really what's effectively a civil war. It obviously goes beyond Iraq's borders. But the real bottom line is that, one, libertarians don't offer any solutions to these problems of statism. I mean, we're not saying, hey, here's the way to solve Iraq and so forth, because that's not what libertarianism is all about. It's not about solving the problems of socialism or imperialism or interventionism. What we're saying is, look, you've made a bad enough mess as it is. Quit pouring fuel onto the fire, which is what they're doing. I mean, you're speculating whether a new president would invade, whether this president's going to invade again. It's a legitimate speculation, but to me, it's enough to see that it's been a manifest failure, this intervention. I think if they send large numbers of American troops back into Iraq, it's just a real formal, public, out loud acknowledgement of what a disaster this policy has been. Now, I know that there are conservatives that said, well, Obama just got us out too soon. We should have stayed there. Well, they also say the same thing about Vietnam. If we're up to them, U.S. troops would still be in Vietnam fighting the Vietnam War. That at some point it's time to acknowledge that you've done enough damage and it's time to get out. And but they create this sense that if the Islamic State were to take over Iraq, that this would be horrible for the United States. It wouldn't make any difference in the world. I mean, we saw this argument during the Cold War that if a communist regime were to stay in Cuba, America wouldn't stand anymore. Or if communism spread to Latin America, like Nicaragua and Venezuela, where you've got big socialist regimes now, or Bolivia, or if we didn't intervene in Vietnam, the dominoes would start falling. It doesn't make any difference who ends up in control of Iraq or any other country. There is absolutely no danger, none, of any nation state attacking, invading, conquering, and occupying the United States. It's just not going to happen. Does that mean that there's not messes in the world? There have always been messes in the world. There's revolutions, there's civil wars, there's dictators, there's tyrannies, there's starvations. But I love the foreign policy of the founding fathers of this country that says Don't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Don't have a big standing army with the capability of doing that type of thing. Because if you do, they're going to end up going abroad and doing such things. And as John Quincy Adams said in his speech to Congress in 1821, if you start moving in that direction and you have a government that's going to be the world's policeman, you yourself are going to be transformed as a nation. And sure enough, that's what's happened. We live under a regime that has the power to assassinate Americans. Did you ever think you'd live under that kind of regime? A power to round up Americans, torture Americans, spy on Americans, this gigantic NSA. I mean, it's all out of control, and it's all. If all we have to do is move toward libertarianism, and these things start clearing up because you start dismantling the interventionism and the empire and the standing army and the CIA and the NSA, and all of a sudden things start moving in a peaceful, harmonious, peaceful direction.
Right. Well, and you take a look at Iraq or any of these examples, and any proposed intervention that you could do, it's that easy to just come up with the hypothetical of, so then what? Even if it works, say, for example, we reinvade Iraq. Who are we fighting for? We're fighting for the Shiite militias of the Badr Brigade, backed up by the Iranian Quds Force. And so, like just now with American air power, they kicked all the Islamic State fighters out of Tikrit. But so now the question is, are they going to populate that town with Shiites and expand the borders of Shiistan? Or are they going to let the local Sunni population come back to what was a predominantly Sunni city just a few months ago? And this is the war that we've been fighting over there since 2003, is kicking Sunnis out and replacing them with Shia this whole time. The Shia, who are backed by Iran, who are supposedly our enemies. Are supposed to be, according to some, a worse enemy than ISIS ever could be. And as far as ISIS ever attacking us or ever being a threat to us, of course, the only minuscule threat from them is that they could get one or two men or very few terrorists somehow through the screen and to the United States, where then they could do some, what's the most horrible thing they could do? Crash a plane, maybe attack a ball game with an automatic rifle or something like that. And then the only point of that, I mean, there's nothing existential in danger about that anyway. But the only danger that it is that it might provoke us to go ahead and do that big stupid invasion that they want us to do. Because the Islamic State, war is the health of the Islamic State. Jacob, they need an enemy, and who better than the North Americans who made it this way in the first place? In the name of us being white Christian foreigners, they want to fight us at Dabiq and bring along the apocalypse like a bunch of John Hageites and all this. So that's the only danger that they pose, is they might successfully bait the American people into supporting their government, falling into the trap of the terrorists once again by overreacting, bogging ourselves down in their soil, bankrupting ourselves, bleeding ourselves in the process, weakening ourselves in the process, and empowering them, which is the story of the last few years. So, I saw Michael Scheuer, the former chief of the CIA's bin Laden unit, on TV. On Fox News, I think it was. And, of course, he was the one who broke the subject because they are on the other side of this on Fox. But he was saying how insane it is that America's backing the Mujahideen against the Shiite Ba'athist government in Damascus, in Syria. That this is crazy, that we're basically the Air Force of the al-Nusra Front, which is al-Qaeda in Syria, and the Islamic State, which is no different, really, other than just it's a break-off group with different leadership. And so the host said, well, what do you think? Should we back Assad and his army against the Islamic State and al-Nusra? And Michael Scheuer, he can be very hawkish and on certain issues. And he said, but he was smart instead of bloodthirsty and said, no, actually we shouldn't back Assad or the Baghdad government against them either, because then we're still just playing directly into their narrative. If we're not outright fighting for them, we're making them look right about us by fighting against them and for the Shiites. And so what we ought to do is just stop. You can't fix this. Just let things work themselves out. It's going to be a bloody mess. Look, George Bush gave Baghdad to the Shiites. It's now a super majority, like 90% Shiite city. That cannot be undone in a short amount of time. And the consequences of that happening are going to continue to reverberate for decades. What, we're going to go in there and ameliorate the consequences? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. And when even Michael Kill-em-all Scheuer is saying just knock it off, then you could probably just take that advice to the bank right there, you know?
Yeah, and the more people they kill, taking one side or the other, it just produces more anti-American anger, more hatred that then, of course, leads to, as you say, the retaliation, the need to save face, go in there and straighten things out. And then they use that as the excuse to take away our own freedoms with the NSA, the roundups, the torture, the powers, the emergency powers that they have. And anyway, Scott, we're out of time, unfortunately. It's been great to have you on the show, man. A real honor to have you on here. Okay, I lost your sound there, Scott.
Oops. Thanks very much, Jacob, for having me on. It was fun to have the tables turn here for a minute.
Yeah, it's been great. Tune into the Scott Horton Show. He's got absolutely the best show on the internet, especially with respect to the guests he has and the interactions he has. I'm Jacob Hornberger. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, and we'll see you next week.